Okay, who's going first? I saw I was first on the program, but I didn't know if you were...
I think you are first, Jeremy. Shall we follow the program?
Oh,
well, you're the boss.
Are we co-hosts so that we can share our screens?
I think you are. I think you
Okay.
are. Hugo and Jeremy, you are. So shall we do like 40 minutes presentation, and I let you know at 35 on only clarifying questions, and then towards the end, basically, you know, we have some discussion, some question. Just let me do a very brief introduction. It's really a pleasure to have Jeremy and Hugo here presenting our special session on firm dynamics and growth. In any say macro conference, these would be the keynote speakers of this conference. So with much ado, I just share the floor with Jeremy, and then I'll do the same with Hugo later on.
Well, Tiago, thanks for inviting me. And I've never been to Brazil before, so this is a real pleasure. This is actually a paper with Yuan Ma, who's a current student at Penn, and then Mehmet Yorukoglu, who is a former student of mine, who used to be deputy governor of the Bank of Turkey, actually, but has returned to academics. And as you can see, hopefully, like he's still on top of things. So free media goods are everywhere, because you can think you have Facebook, Google search, Google Maps, Pandora, Twitter, YouTube, etc. And I could go on forever about all the stuff.
Jeremy, let me just make one comment. Could you make full screen, please? Just Control L.
I tried that on my computer when I go, oh, it worked. Sometimes it didn't work. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. What was I going to say? And all of these free goods are financed by advertising. And what's, in recent times, what's important here is that there's been a huge increase in digital advertising. And it's a very recent phenomenon. It was just like 0.3% in 1997 and 25% roughly now. And it's actually the dominant medium for advertising. And the benefits are like cost effective. They provide free media goods, and they also stimulate price competition. So if you look at the right panel here, you can see advertising to GDP. It's been roughly like 2% a year for as long back as you can go. But if you look at the left panel, there's huge reallocation within that 2% spending. So you can see like newspapers and magazines are like really in a secular decline. TV came around in 1940, it's risen, now it's declining. And then we have the recent thing, which is the internet, which now exceeds TV in ad spending. And that's what we want to discuss here. So we're going to have a theoretical model. We're going to look at directed and undirected advertising. I'll start with undirected advertising because the talk's short. I may never get to directed advertising. There's two basic advertising models. One is like the branding model of advertising. Then the other model is that, advertising conveys information. We take the informational approach here. We're going to have in the model digital and traditional advertising. Digital advertising will be cost effective. It'll be delivered through free media products. Like traditional advertising is too. If you think about TV and radio, you don't really pay for those. The media goods are going to complement leisure, which I'll talk about when I get to there. We'll have two types of consumers, rich and poor. And the nice thing about the model is it's a bit of an alternative to a search model. An equilibrium distribution of prices are going to rise, even though in this model, everything's perfectly competitive. And the equilibrium won't be efficient because media goods are going to be underprovided. And also, if you can't direct advertising, it's wasteful. So for instance, if you're advertising Mercedes-Benz on TVs, most of the people can't afford to buy a Mercedes that are watching your TV ad. So in that sense, like you're wasting your money. And then we'll characterize the optimal tax subsidy policy to bring you back to the efficient equilibrium. We're going to take it to the data, and we're going to calibrate our models to markups that we observe. one of people's estimates and markups are all over the place, and one of the reasons they're all over the place is people don't really know how you should deal with advertising. But as I'm going to show you here, like you can get a big markup even with perfect competition if you treat advertising the way most people do. We'll get a ratio. We're going to match the ratio of advertising spending to consumption. That's roughly 2%. The ratio of digital advertising to traditional advertising, well, that increases over time, so we have to put the time path in for that. We'll match the click-through rate for digital advertising. That's roughly people click through about 2% of ads they see on the web. And then we're going to match the trends and time spent on leisure, because we're thinking most of these goods, such as YouTube, are leisure goods, so you kind of watch them, for fun. And then we'll have two types of people, college and non-college. This is important because non-college educated people, their increase in leisure was larger. And then there's some evidence from people like Aguirre and Mark Bills that the non-educated people or non-college educated people tend to spend more time on things like video games, etc., which is part of our model here. So the free digital goods, they'll boost welfare significantly. And I'm going to try to convince you that in the American economy, there's a huge amount of unmeasured innovation. So I've always been on one side of this. My side has always been that we're kind of in an industrial revolution in the digital economy, and I've maybe thought this probably since the 1990s. On the other side, there's people like Robert Gordon and Chad Jones that claim we're in a slump. And, this is a debate within economics that's going on forever, I guess with no resolution. But I'm just telling you my opinion, but, I'm not the guardian of truth. So leisure is going to increase in our model, but it'll be more pronounced for the non-college educated. I'm going to show you that the cost of these free media goods, that's going to be financed disproportionately by the rich. And so this has an appealing distributional impact. And then the digital advertising is going to increase price competition, and that actually will benefit the rich the most, because the rich tend to buy in higher price markets, and those markets are less competitive, so to speak. So digital advertising, relatively speaking to the more mundane goods like cereal, is going to have like a bigger impact. So just a little bit of history. Advertising's been around forever. Like the Babylonian merchants, they employed people to shout out ads on streets. The Romans put signage on their stores, like grapes signified a wine store. Ben Franklin, he's from Philadelphia, so we like him here. He published the first magazine ad in the United States. Ben Franklin was a printer, probably, as most of you know. This is another Philadelphia company, Ayers and Sons. They founded the first advertising campaigns. And so they're actually responsible for the slogan, "Diamonds are forever," that we all know. The first direct mail ads came in 1872. That was the Montgomery Ward catalog, quickly followed by the Sears catalog. The first radio ad ran in New York City. It was for apartments. That was in 1922. The first TV ad was for a baseball game. That was in New York City in 1941. And the first email ad came from DEC Computers. They just sent out like information on their new computers to all DEC users on the DEC network. So coming to the recent times, the first clickable ad was only in 1994. And this was part of AT&T's You Will campaign. And this is what they showed. If you looked on whatever web page you were on, it said, "Have you ever clicked your mouse right here?" And then on the right, that's the name of our thing. It said, "You will." And so 40% of people actually clicked on that. It actually didn't really go anywhere. It just went to the words AT&T, and then they said something about a museum. But just to highlight, 1994 is not very long ago. And Google started in 1998. And I guess the first social network was actually 6 Degrees, which said that everybody was separated from anyone else by the world by 6 connections. But really, it took off with MySpace, and then I'd say Facebook, which had the second mover advantage, is the big name. on this. So Facebook, like that, it's only 2008. I mean, that's, you know, very recent history. So if I look at the right panel here, you can just see like the huge rise of these firms, Google, Facebook, and actually Amazon. So here, this is Amazon's ad revenue because they put ads for third parties on their website. But you can see from 2000, like just a tremendous growth in these companies, which are all connected to digital advertising. If you go to the left panel, that sort of shows the breakdown and where digital advertising, you know, comes from. So today, 2018, I'm going to call today, most of it comes from, you know, like search, right? And Google has most of the market for search. But then after that, and growing quickly, is ads on social media. And then, you know, if you just go to various websites like magazines or something, you see a banner on the side that, or a newspaper that you can click on, you know, that's shown by the black histogram here. So here, this is showing the kind of, I guess if you're a business economist, you'd call this a rate of return. It's called a cash multiple. That shows the increase in your sales for $1 invested in advertising. So you can see that digital search has a very high cash multiple. So, you know, it's alluring to business people. This left panel is very, you know, important for the analysis coming. If you look at ad spending, say mobile, you can see that the percentage of ad spending devoted to mobile devices extremely accurately tracks the time that people spend on mobile devices. And the same with TV. At first I thought this had to be an error, and you know, we doubled and triple checked it. But the idea is that wherever you spend time, especially leisure time, advertisers are going to try to get you. So here's a good example. There are companies in the US, their sole business is to put ads in men's washrooms just to capture that few minutes, you know, you're there. And, you know, obviously they have the same thing for women's washrooms. So here's like an amazing thing. If I looked on the right-hand side, this is the number of applications in Google's Play Store. And it's over now in 2020, there are more than 3 million apps on Google Play Store. So this is what I'm saying. I take this, you know, you get apps to tune your guitar, apps for fitness, apps if you know, want to choose your wine, apps for everything. And there's millions of them. This is just on Google's Play Store. And so I say this, for the purpose of this paper, is a huge amount of unmeasured innovation. If I go to the left-hand panel and I'm asked the question, how much are people paying for these apps? Well, look at the $10 thing. This says that 90% of people spend less than $10 a year on acquiring these apps. So essentially, they're free. So I'll turn to the model. So in the model, we're going to have 3 types of goods, just generic consumption, media leisure goods, and leisure. And I'm going to index, there'll be a bunch of varieties for generic consumption. I'll index them by I. The maximum number of varieties will be 1. Consumption, there'll be a discrete quantity for each of these varieties. You either consume 0 or 1. This just makes the model easier. Anyone can enter into producing one of these varieties, subject to a fixed entry cost. This is this symbol fractor R. So the production side is almost like one of Hugo's industry dynamic models. There's going to be perfect competition, just like in one of Hugo's models. Here, the only obstacle is you have to advertise to sell. And PI will be the price of a good that a producer of vintage eye posts. And there'll be many people producing this same vintage, but the interesting thing is they can all charge a different price for exactly the same product. Leisure will be marked by L and hours worked by H. There'll be 2 types of advertising, traditional and digital. Ads will be delivered through media goods, either through TV, radio, you know, YouTube videos or whatever. Z is the click-through rate for traditional ads. Actually, I guess that's zeta. Phi is the click-through rate for digital ads. We have data on for digital ads, and for traditional ads, I'm going to have to try to measure that. And media goods, like the other goods, are going to just be consumed in fixed either a 0 or a 1, because they're free. People will, consume them. Have two types of consumers: unskilled, which will be non-college educated. They'll have a massive T. Their productivity will be 1. Skilled, they're the remaining 1 minus T. Their productivity will be some number bigger than 1, and then they'll have an education cost factor. So these are preferences, kind of standard. These are just your consumption over all the goods that are being produced in the economy. The new thing here is this term here. M is all these free media goods you're getting associated with advertising. And the upper limit of the integral M is the total amount of these varieties of these free media goods. L is your leisure, and media goods are entering in as Edgeworth-Pareto complements. So in the theory, I'm going to restrict rho to be less than 0, so they are Edgeworth-Pareto complements. When we estimate the model, that's not a restriction actually, but it turns out, of course, they are Edgeworth-Pareto complements. This is a consumer's budget constraint. His expenditure over all goods has to equal his income, and his income will be different depending on whether you're skilled or unskilled. And here, this is a bit of abusive notation. We use P 2 different ways. So for the consumer, P is the minimum price of good I. So in a consumer's information set, he'll have many prices. And of course, he's going to pick the lowest price when he's purchasing the good, because there's no quality consideration or anything in this model. Production function is just a linear production function. So gamma here is, or 1 over gamma is the marginal cost. Sorry, gamma would be your marginal cost. Traditional advertising has this cost function. Digital advertising has the same looking cost function, except there's a Q, and Q is the cost advantage of digital advertising. So Q is less than 1, and we're going to measure how it declines over time. So here's the heart of the model. This is a firm's advertising choice. So a firm is free to pick the price that it wants, P, and then given that price, it does a certain amount of advertising, traditional and digital, to maximize this. So the first term here is its expected sales, and the last term here is its expected costs. So I should say actually this is sales minus the cost of production. But the important thing is S is the probability that you're going to make a sale at your posted priced P, and that's an endogenous variable, which I got to explain to you how you get that in a second. But all firms are going to do the same amount of traditional advertising and the same amount of digital advertising, but AT and AD may differ from each other. But AT is the same for all firms, and AD is the same for all firms. And by that I mean, if a firm sets if there's two firms, they're setting different prices, it turns out here they still are doing the same amount of advertising, even though their prices are different. So in this model, I'm just going to start here, but if you look at the paper, this is actually derived. So ads follow up. The number of ads that a consumer gets follows a Poisson distribution. So if you call the number of ads I, then we have this Poisson distribution for the number of ads a person gets, where A is the total number of ads per variety. So this is the number of ads per variety. And what I'm interested in is calculating eventually is the advertised price distribution. So this red P, this is the probability that a price is less than P. So in what follows, I'm going to just assume that P is the price that you're setting. And then I want to know what is the probability that the consumer is going to have some prices below the price that you're setting, and then he won't buy from you. So if P is the probability that the price is less than P and the person has I ads, then 1 minus P to the power I is the odds that he has no price lower than your price P. And from that, now I can get the function S, that's the probability of a sale at price P. because what I'm doing here is, in the first term here, is I'm counting over all possibilities of ads. So the person could have no ad from another person, 1 ad from another person, 2 ads from other people, 3 ads, all the way up to infinity. And this is capturing that. The second term here, that's capturing whether the consumer will buy your good at the posted price. So for instance, think about an unskilled person. He might not be able to, if you post a really high price, he might not be able to buy it. So I is an indicator function here that will just say, it'll be 1 if he will buy at that price and he has no prices below that, and 0 if he won't. Okay, so these are 2 indicator functions that are just saying whether a consumer will buy or not at those prices, which come out of a consumer problem, which I'll talk just a tiny bit about later. So there's going to be a minimum price in the economy. That's P lower bar. Actually, that just depends on technological things, which I'll tell you about, which are in the paper. And then there's 2 maximum prices. One for the unskilled people, that's going to be this price P tau lower bar. And then the maximum price a skilled person can afford to pay, that will be P lower bar, upper bar. And these depend on the 2 consumer problems. And from this model, you get an equilibrium price distribution. So the interesting thing is, for prices from the lower price to the highest price that an unskilled consumer can afford to pay, it follows this. And then after the higher price that the highest price the unskilled person can pay, there's a jump in the price distribution. And then the price distribution follows this. And the reason we have to have this jump point is as follows, is that as you imagine a firm, as the firm crosses the threshold and of prices, and it's no longer the case that the unskilled consumers will buy the good, there's a discrete drop down in demand because we only have 2 types of consumers here. So to make up for that discrete drop in demand, there has to be a discrete jump up in the minimum price that a firm can sell after that point, because all firms are earning 0 profits, right? So if demand drops all of a sudden, then to cover that, you're going to have to jack up your price at this point here. So the advertised price distribution looks like this. And then the transacted price distribution, that's the red one, will look like this. So look at the price 110. So you can see it like at 110, 40% of advertised prices would lie below that, but 80% of transacted prices lie below that. And that's because consumers are always buying at the lowest price in their information set, not at some higher advertised price. Okay, so the supply of media goods, that's M in the model. That's just given by, N is the number of firms producing in a variety. That's an endogenous variable. That's just given by the amount of traditional advertising and digital advertising divided through by the click-through rates. So if I look at digital advertising, if I want to get people to observe AD ads, then I have to supply in this model MD free goods, and each free good has the ad has only a click-through rate of phi here. Okay. So here's our first proposition, which I didn't show you the consumer problem. That's that leisure is increasing in the number of media goods. And regular consumption, that's decreasing the number of media goods, because if leisure is rising, people are working less, so they're going to consume less. And regular consumption is obviously increasing in the level of skill, and work effort rises with the cost of an education. But the first thing here, this is like an important thing, is this is coming from the assumption of Edgeworth-Pareto complementarity of leisure and media goods in the utility. So if you want to play want to watch YouTube, you have to spend time on it. And because they're complements, if having YouTube, an extra unit of YouTube videos, increases the marginal utility of leisure. Therefore, you'll spend more time. Our equilibrium's not efficient for 2 reasons. There's going to be an under provision of media goods, and then there's excessive advertising. when it's not perfectly directed. So when it's perfectly directed, the second point no longer holds, but the first point would still be true. So you can show in this model that the optimum subsidy is given by this. The subsidy in this economy is just a weighted average of the marginal rate of substitutions between media goods and leisure for the rich and the poor and the rich. Because there's excessive advertising, you should fine advertising. So yeah, impose that on. I won't go into the mechanics of this. That's because, why is there excessive advertising? Because when it's undirected, you're sending the ads with the high prices in this economy, you're sending them to unskilled people that will never buy at those high prices. So that's like a waste of advertising resources. And to get rid of that excessive advertising, you should tax advertising. And then in this economy here, you'd like to get the highest price that the poor person pays to be equal to the marginal production cost. I don't really like this implication of the optimal tax cum subsidy policy, but the math says it's there. So I'll talk a bit about that later. Okay, so I'll talk about the calibration now. So we're going to set the unskilled part of the population to be 65%. The skilled part, that'll be college educated, 35%. We're going to set the productivity of a college educated person to 2.35. So in our model, that gives the correct relative incomes of college versus non-college educated people. The click-through rate for digital advertising, that comes from the data. It's about 2.5%. We have to estimate the one for traditional advertising. And then I'm just going to normalize marginal cost to 1. I don't think that matters. So I'm going to set the markup to 1.07 in our economy. So that'll be your price over the marginal production cost, which is gamma. Okay. The advertising to consumption ratio, we're going to set to 2%. I showed you historically it's always been roughly 2%. To figure out the cost advantage of digital advertising, I'm going to look at the ratio of digital to traditional advertising spending. So for instance, if you look at the years, this slowly increased. So in our calibration strategy, not slowly increased, but it increased from 2% to 28%. So our calibration strategy would have a corresponding drop in Q. And then to get the consumer's preference parameters, I'm going to match up as close as I can the model's prediction with leisure against the data's prediction on leisure for college and non-college educated people. And I'm going to look at the increase in leisure that was devoted to time spent on media goods. So I'll talk about this now. So leisure is defined as time spent here on entertainment, social activities, relaxing, active recreation, sleeping, eating, and personal care. I think this is Aguirre and Hurst measure too. It rose for both non-college and college educated people, but more for college educated people. The interesting thing, as I'll show you, is that these increases in leisure closely tracked increases in time spent on media. So that's time spent on TV, radio, reading, movies, computers, and games. And I'm going to calibrate to the gains in leisure that are just associated with time spent on these media goods. Okay, so just to show you here. So 2003, that's our first year. That's kind of the year, roughly, Google started. The blue bars are tracking for non-college educated people. So in 2003, this is if they had 1 unit at a time, the data says they spent 64% of their time on leisure. So when we moved to 2010, their leisure increased. The thatched bars showing how much of that increase in leisure was devoted to free media goods like watching, playing video games, reading magazines and stuff like that. And you can see almost all of the change in leisure was absorbed by changes in these free media goods. And then in 2018, it's even bigger. The green bars do the same thing for college educated people. You can see that the increase in leisure was less for them. And also you can see if I look at 2018 that less of the fraction of the increase in leisure for them was devoted to media goods. Maybe they're doing more exercise or something relative to the non-college educated people. So here's our data targets for our model. We match the markup exactly. We match advertising to GDP ratio exactly. If I look at traditional to digital to traditional advertising, that's matched up exactly. Leisure's not, matched up exactly because it came from a minimization problem. The blue bars, the blue things are for non-college educated people. So I can see there was an increase in leisure for non-college educated people from 2003 to 2018. This is leisure and media goods. You can see the model has, roughly the same increase in leisure. For college educated people, there was also an increase in leisure from 2003 to 2018, and the model tracks that pretty well too. The thing to notice is that college educated people always have less leisure than non-college educated people, and the model is tracking that. So now I can measure the welfare gains from the introduction of digital advertising from 2003. And they're pretty large. So the equivalent variation is worth 2.5% of your consumption for non-college educated people, and for a college educated person, 2.6%. So this is in line with other people's work on, like Goolsby and Klenow, for instance, looked at the welfare gains from the internet. I have a paper with Karen Kopecki that looked at what your PC is worth to you. And Brynjolfsson is like a giant in, in the business of the digital economy. So he gets sort of similar welfare gains from, I would say, the computer revolution or the information age, whatever we want to call it. You can break it down into how much was due to an increase in leisure, how much was due to an increase in media goods. I mean, these things aren't mutually exclusive. Like the media goods are in our model are driving the increase in leisure, and then there will be a fall in consumption because the non-college educated people are working less, but on net they're still getting an increase in their welfare. And you can see for the college educated people, their increase in leisure is less. They're getting less from the media goods, but their consumption drops by less. And that's because for the rich people, there's more price competition in the high price goods that they're buying. And that, translates into like an increase in their purchasing power. So for a given reduction in their leisure, you see a smaller like reduction in their consumption. Okay, so you can ask who pays. And if I just break it down, look at non-college and college educated people, the non-college educated people are paying roughly 27%, and the college educated 72%. But then we have to remember that the college educated people are only 35% of the population. So when you take that into account, they're actually paying 208% via the advertising costs of the goods they buy, versus the non-college educated people that are paying 42% via the advertising costs of the goods that they buy. So here's an interesting thing. You can look at the welfare gain from the optimum tax subsidy plan and the welfare. So I'm thinking here, I'm taking our undirected equilibrium. I'm now, for 2018, I'm now saying what would happen if I put in the optimal tax subsidy plan. And the welfare gain from doing that is very small. It's roughly 0.02% of consumption. And that's in line with traditional welfare analysis. So if you look at Lucas's welfare gains from eliminating business cycles, that would be 0.07%. Rees in an older paper said, what would the welfare gain be from getting rid of unions? His estimate was 0.014%. This number lies in between these two. So, the welfare gains from the inefficiency in the economy is sort of matching up, with other traditional welfare gain exercises. So here's a question that comes up is, you got a 2.5% gain in consumption equivalent variation from these free goods and the increased price competition. That's 100 times bigger than the welfare gain you would get from going to the first best equilibrium. So you could almost say Google et al.'s business models are socially efficient and they have an attractive distributional impact. So I neglected all the bad things about Google, right? Google and Facebook. Yesterday in the United States, for instance, they levied antitrust charges against Facebook. They already did that in Europe for Google, I believe, and Facebook. Then people don't like the fact they're collecting all this information about you, and who knows what they might be using it for. And then thirdly, people accuse both of these companies and Twitter of censoring ideas on their websites. You know, and all of that's ignored here. And plus, when I said yesterday, Facebook was, you know, they're looking into them for antitrust violations. Well, Google has 90% of the search market, so, you know, who knows, like, maybe they have monopolistic pricing, you know, for people that do advertising on their website because they're such a giant. So again, that is ignored here. We're just looking at the benefits. Okay, so I think I got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to now switch to another version of the model. I'm going to say, what would happen if you can direct ads only to consumers who might buy them at the posted price? So in this model, you would never send an ad with a high price to like an unskilled consumer because you know he can't afford to buy it. So in this equilibrium, he'll separate into two mutually exclusive groups. One group will sell just to the low-skilled people, and another group can sell to the high-skilled people. And we're going to say there's free entry. If you're a firm, you can decide, you know, where you're going. And out of this, there's going to come, you can theoretically, two advertised price distributions. One price distribution for the unskilled college people, and then another price distribution for the college educated. And we still get the same formula for the media goods because I'm assuming that even if I'm not going to buy a Ferrari, I could still perhaps read Car and Driver magazine for free. So we can ask, what's the welfare gain from directed advertising? Well, with directed advertising, so this is relative to the 2018 equilibrium with solely undirected advertising. So with directed advertising, there's going to be less media goods provision because you're going to economize on the advertising. There'll also be increased price competition at the upper end because you can target the rich people more exclusively. And it turns out that this helps the rich people the most. So again, this is a move from undirected to directed advertising in 2018, where we have digital advertising already in place. So for the non-college educated people, that leads to a welfare loss because there's less media goods. For the college educated people, it leads to a welfare gain. Even though there's less media goods for them, it's stimulating price competition at the upper end of the price distribution. And an interesting thing about this is there's two papers, like one's by David Argenta, who's at Penn State University, and another's by Klenow and Goolsby and Klenow. They both essentially do the same thing. They look at price data. Say David Argenta looks at what happened to the CPI over the last 10 years. And he claims that the price changes in the CPI have worked to help rich people more than poor people. So that's like the takeaway from both of these papers, that if you just look at what's happening to the distribution of prices, it seems that prices are favoring the rich vis-a-vis the price changes vis-a-vis the poor. And you know, here we have like a model of this, why this would be the case. And here I'm just showing you what happens to the transacted price distribution. Well, in our model, when you move to directed directed advertising, for the non-college educated people, the price distribution, you can't even see the change. But for the college educated people, you can see a huge collapse in the price distribution because in the thin markets, right, now there's going to be more price competition. If you can buy a Ferrari online and all the dealers' prices are there, you know, it's going to help the rich more than the poor. That's the idea here, where traditionally maybe Ferraris, you know, would be a very specialized market, maybe hard to get information about the cars. So I'll just tell you what would, I think I'm finishing on time. So what do we do? We model digital advertising. This is still work in process with both directed and undirected advertising. We're trying to formulate an equilibrium now where we have a mixture of directed and undirected advertising. The problem is probably mostly empirical, that I don't know if there's any good data on what's directed and what's undirected. So the free media goods are financed by advertising. An equilibrium distribution of prices emerges. The equilibrium is not efficient because media goods are underprovided. And then there's excessive advertising when advertising is undirected. We calculated the tax subsidy policy that would rectify the equilibrium to make it more efficient. We matched the main features of the US data, the price market, markup, advertising to consumption ratios, digital to advertising expenditures, the click-through rate for digital advertising, all the trends we see in leisure associated with media goods. We got a large welfare gain from the provision of free media goods. We are, you know, takeaway, at least Mehmet's and mine, I don't know about you, Juan, is that this measures a lot of unmeasured innovation. On this too, when I look at the innovations being stifled, then I'd like to, you know, ask these people, like, how are we getting vaccines so quickly? And what do they think about SpaceX? And what are they thinking about electric cars? And what are they thinking about boring tunnels that are coming online to transport people underground really quickly by Elon Musk? So again, like, you know, this is just me personally. I see innovation everywhere. There's the welfare gains from the optimal tax subsidy policy, by contrast, are quite small. So that leads us to wonder, is Google et al.'s business model more or less socially efficient? Digital advertising also promoted price competition, but it seems like that helps the richer people most because they're operating in the high-priced, thinner markets. That's it. And so, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Really on time. We have actually, you know, a couple of minutes for questions. I would make just one question. So what's really happening with output in your economy? Measure output in the way that we measure output. So what's really, can you?
Yeah, I can explain it. Okay, so I'm not exactly 100% sure of your question, but I think one of the questions you're asking is, why isn't Google in measured output? Is that the idea?
So the idea is that you started with the motivation that, you know, Gordon say basically there is not much innovation and growth is
yes. Okay, so I can explain it then. So that's what I thought you were asking. So here's the answer. Like, you have to go into the national income and product accounts and look and see what they do with advertising. So imagine I buy an advert from you for $10. So I've increased your labor income by $10. But in the national income and product accounts, I'm allowed to take that off my profits. So on the right-hand side, that's the national income, the side of the accounts. It's plus 10 for you, minus 10 for me, and so it's a wash. Okay, so advertising's not coming in directly. Now, you can contrast that with, if instead of advertising, I bought a computer for you from $10. So then I'd pay you $10, but the national income and product accountants don't take that $10 off my profits. They capitalize it and they call it investment, and then they shove it onto the left-hand side of the national income and product accounts. So there's a debate on this. What should you do? So, for instance, Corrado, Halton, and Sickle, they claim instead of expensing advertising, which they do now, you should capitalize it and treat it like it's an investment good and give it a very high depreciation rate, say 3 years. And they adjust the national income and product accounts to take into account things like advertising. Other things are very similar, like on-the-job training. That's done exactly the same way. That's not counted as investment. And to make it even, a better example is software. So until recently, national income and product accountants didn't count software as investment. And they realized that was incorrect. They should count it as investment. And so that would increase GDP up a little bit. So this is a debate, it's all over the place. Like I guess Prescott, Corrado, Halton, and Sickle are big names. McGrath and Prescott are other big names. Raul, Cesar's classmate, Raul Lopez, he has a paper saying that these mistakes, I'm putting that in quotes, in national income and product accounting have led to things like looking like there's a decline in labor share where there really isn't a decline in labor share. So these are all what people call intangible investments. And it's like a part of a big debate of which advertising is one of them. And some people, in part of the debate on the markups, is how you treating advertising in the markup. So people that the traditional things I guess the idea is, should you be treating advertising as a marginal cost in calculating the markup? Traditionally, the answer is no, and so you get a big markup.
Very good. So this is almost like a University of Rochester, end of the 19th, right? So Hugo, it's really a pleasure to have you. Please.
Okay, you can hear me. You can see the screen also.
Yes, looks beautiful.
All right, thank you. Okay, this is a joint paper. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. I wish I were able to have a caipirinha after this with you guys, but
for sure.
Next time I take the rain check. This is a joint paper with Julian and Rish, and we've been presenting this, for a little while. So this is maybe not as new as Jeremy's, but let me kind of go from here. So the paper is about, a series of puzzling aggregate trends in the US since the 1980s that have received a lot of attention, and you've probably seen a lot of papers on this. One is what's been called decline in dynamism, in this case, a fall in entry rates from, and by the way, this is US, and this is all US firms, and its entry rates have dropped from 14% to 8%, and the decline has been steady. There's been also a decline in exit rates, so a little bit less than that, on the order of 2%. And then there's been this increase in concentration that has received a lot of attention in both in average firm size and concentration, measured by, let's say, the share of firms that have over 200 employees. It went from 51, the employment in those firms went from 51% to 58%. And similar, trends you observe if you did, a different bracketing in terms of concentration. And finally, there's also the decline in the corporate labor share that went from 66% to 60%. And the flip of the coin of that has been the rise in markups. So this paper is about this, and trying to understand. And I think we started this trying to understand what's going on with these trends. And what we're going to bring into this picture is it's sort of in a general equilibrium setting, the role that there has been a slowdown in population growth. So the US, as I'm going to document, has had a very sharp decline in the growth of labor force. And at the same time, a commensurate process that we're going to see, obviously, that is very closely linked to it, which is firm aging. And so the population of firms has aged. This follows, partly from the decrease in firm entry rates. And as firms age, that has had implications over the aggregates, simply from the fact that, older firms are very different than young firms. Older firms are bigger, older firms have higher survival rates. And so the sort of averages across all age groups have changed because of this change in composition. So we're going to focus on these aspects. So just to overview the results, we first show that the reallocation across firm age groups dominates as an explanation for the rise in concentration, the rise in average firm size, the decline that I mentioned in exit rates, and with additional assumptions, the fall in labor share. And this is because older firms tend to be larger firms have lower labor share, and this is a fact. And so again, by composition, aging of the population of firms will lead to a decline in labor share. So what we show is that the main source of this decline comes from the decline in entry rates. And this is the factor that generated this sort of change in age composition of firms. And the mother of all changes, if you want, comes from the declining population growth. So when we think about the change in entry rates, it's going to come from the declining population growth. So this is a paper that sort of shows the interaction between two forces. One is the force of population decline, and demographics have received a lot of attention in many aspects of economic research, and this is one of them now. And at the same time, the interaction with what we call the demographics of firms. So this change in the age structure of firms, which are obviously closely related. And so if you ignored this firm demographics effect and you just looked at the decline in population growth, you would explain about just 1/3 of the effects of what we've seen, the decline in entry rates and the increase in concentration. Whereas once you include this, I mean, we explain almost, we're able to account for, almost all the changes. So it means that this feedback from the change in firm demographics to entry rates is about 2/3 of the effects. And then you also do, I mean, there's been a non-stationary processes going on in the US in terms of population. Partly we had the baby boom that implied a very large increase in the growth of labor force up to, pretty much the, mid-70s or 80s. And then a decline in, first of all, the baby boomers coming out of the labor force, plus a decline in fertility rates that has been affecting the later stage. So it's a very non-stationary process. We're going to show that not accounting for transitional effects, it's like doing a steady state kind of comparison, would miss about half of the actual effects that we see. So let me start with some motivating evidence, and here we go. Right, so these pictures show the averages across all firms in the US, and this includes all firms, and regardless of what kind of industry they're in. And so you can see the rise in concentration that I mentioned before, going from 52% to 58%, the increase in average size of an order of a 20% rise in the average size of firms. And the 2 percentage point decline, much less, much more noisy on exit rates in the same time period. So I'm going to show you now a series of graphs that do exactly the same, but do these curves, calculate these curves by age cohort. So let me go with the first one, which is concentration. Okay, so what are these curves? Each curve tracks over time. It's not tracking one, it's kind of fixing an age bracket. So for example, the lower one is new firms. And it looks at new firms in 1980, 1981, 1982, and so on. So new firms in each of those years, and calculates the concentration, the same statistic that I mentioned before for that age group. And this is done for each of the age brackets. Obviously, as you can see, this picture shows you, one is that obviously concentration increases with age. So, as we consider higher age brackets, we're moving up in this picture. But the other thing that you can see is that, once we condition on age, it doesn't seem that there is, a rising trend. In fact, if anything, there's a declining trend for older firms. So same happens, with average firm size. Again, no trend coming from, one student condition on age. And the same happens with exit rates. So how we get, from the lower to the upper end, obviously, is because there has been a change in the composition or the age structure of firms. So this shows you that, it's very important in order to understand the evolution of these aggregates to take into consideration the change in this firm demographics that I was talking about. So here's a statistic, one statistic of firm demographic change. You can see the share of firms that are over 10 years old. From late 1980s throughout the 2015. And you've seen that it went from, in order of 30% to almost 50%. So firms are getting old. I mean, there's no question about that. Okay, and this is, take any statistic of the distribution of age of firms and you're gonna get the same picture. At the same time, entry rates have been declining, and this is kind of this is what I told you before. Entry rates went down from 14% per year to about 8% per year. So it's been a gap in 6 percentage points of fall in entry rates. So given that the picture that I showed you before on, let me go back here, on exit rates, you see there's really no trend on exit rates. So if you have a population of firms, the kind of survival is not changing in terms of exit rates. So the hazard rates of exit are not changing, or death rates if you want. So it must be that it's going to be a change in the age distribution of firms. It must be coming from this change in entry rates. And this is sort of the dominant factor. I don't want to play it in the sense that, yes, there are some there is some magnitude in which there have been changes in the exit rates, but this is definitely the dominant factor in explaining the aging of firms. And if you just take this entry rate into an accounting framework, but just keeping constant the exit rates of firms, basically just project by that what would be the share of firms that are over 10 years old, this is what you get from the data. So definitely it is the dominant factor. All right, so what we're going to try now is to unbundle this change in the entry rates and try to understand what are the sources for these change in entry rates. So the entry rate, so let me go through that process. So here's a notation. ET is going to represent the average size of firms, and I'm going to be a little bit, loose in the sense that I'm going to not make a distinction between employment and labor force. The changes in unemployment rates throughout this period have been minimal compared to the magnitudes that we're seeing here. So it's not going to be very costly in terms of understanding the data. So here, the average size of firms, ET, is just a ratio of the total employment divided by the number of firms. So NT stands for employment or labor force. I'm going to use it interchangeably, and MT, the number of firms. And you just take logs and this is the change, and then take a time derivative. The change in the number of firms can be decomposed in the change in total employment minus the change in average firm size. So if average firm size had not changed, the change in the number of firms, obviously, it's going to have to match the change in total employment. Okay. At the same time, the change in the number of firms, the growth rate, of the number of firms, can be decomposed into lambda, which is the entry rate, and psi, which is the exit rate. So it's just the difference between entry and exit rates that explain the growth rate in the number of firms. Okay, so taking those two together, we can now write, these are identities, so, we can discuss many things, but not this. This is the entry rate, and it's going to be equal to the growth rate of the number of workers or employment, or they said, as I'm going to growth rate of a labor force, minus the growth rate in the average firm size, and plus the exit rates. So think about, just to fix ideas, if there were no growth in the number of firms and we're in a steady state, then entry rate is going to be equal to the exit rate. If on top of that there's some growth, entry rates will also accommodate that growth rate. And then there obviously, if there's been changes in average firm size, then, you know, entry rates will respond to that too. All right, so let's consider now this first term, which is the change in the growth rate of the labor force. And here's the picture. This is sort of what I was telling you before, the non-stationary process that we've seen. From the 1940s to the peak in the 1970s, where it peaked at the growth rate of the labor force of 2.6% per year. And then, drastically coming down from that point to current levels, which are more like European sort of type levels, which are, or developed European side level, which are in the order of 0.5%. So this is a dramatic, very dramatic change. And so we can take our accounting framework that I told you before, take the entry rate of firms at the decomposition that we had, and let's ask, is this driving force enough by itself, right? And so in a naive way, saying, well, suppose that, we, again, took a steady state model and took a model of those where exit maybe rates for some reason are exogenous or at least do not depend on the age of firms. So, and fix the exit rate at the average of the time period, which would be 12%, or the beginning of the time period, 12%. And then, so just feed in, so these two constants just feed in the change in the in labor force. And you can see, this is the, line up here, that it does qualitatively fit the data in the sense that there's been an increase and a decrease thereafter. But the data is much more, a much more amplitude in this inverted U-shape, trend or cycle than what we see in just plugging in labor force only. In fact, the labor force only expressed 1/3 of the change, and so the rest has to come, from somewhere. So what about where does it come in the data just from looking at this, naive or mindless, if you want, decomposition? Well, 2% is what we observed, which is was the purple line before. Average firm size has increased, and that contributes about to 2% more. And there's also been a decline in exit rates. As I mentioned, it was about 2%. Again, that's 2% for the force. So 1/3 of each is explained, or it's accounted by changes in each of these variables. Okay, so now, this is obviously an accounting framework, because when we think about models, changes in, as I mentioned before, changes in the growth rate of labor force will feed back on changes in, for instance, in exit rates as the age, distribution of firm changes. And so there are feedbacks, obviously, from that. And so this is really not an accounting in terms of a model, but simply is an accounting of kind of endogenous objects, right? So we're going to take now into account these feedback effects, and noticing that changes in entry rates are going to change the age distribution, and this is going to affect firm size and exit rates. Okay, and the decrease in population growth will imply a decline in entry rates, that declining entry rates and aging of firms. That aging of firms would lead to decline in exit rates, which will feed back to declining entry rates, and so on. So there's a sort of a feedback effect out there. So when we think about the this in the endogenous setting that I'm going to describe in a minute in terms of a model that we're going to calibrate, what you get is the following, which is if you ignore these transitional path and just look at long run effects, so like compare two steady states. But compare steady states which differ, one with a growth rate of labor force of 2.5% per year, one with a growth of labor force at only, let's say, 0.5%. Then what you're going to get is, in the long run, entry rates are going to fall by 3%. So 2% is directly the decline in the labor force growth rate. The rest comes from the implied, by the change in firm demographics, a decline in 1% in the exit rates. So it's about a multiplier of 1.5 in this long run. Obviously, there's 3 points that is left over, left aside. So this is just explaining the long run. That's going to come from transitional dynamics. So the two effects, one is the baby boom, which obviously was not a steady state predating the peak, and the fact that we're not yet at a steady state. So very, theory here is really not much. I mean, it's just an organizing framework, and so I'm going to give a very simple framework. There's an inelastic supply of labor, let's say. I mean, here we're considering this as the unique input, labor, and we're going to take that as a numeraire. And there's these firms that are being hit by these shocks that, driving the firm dynamics, and sort of that will be also driving firm demographics. These shocks follow some persistent Markov process, and it will be the case that, there's going to be a threshold endogenously determined such that when firms shocks get below that threshold, they're going to exit. So death rates are going to be endogenous and are going to be determined by, these thresholds. There's aggregated market conditions. Think about, a market price or an aggregate market price, if you want, or a price in a competitive model and so on. And this is kind of what helps us close the model in equilibrium. And employment function, which is increasing in both this, idiosyncratic shock. So firms with higher shocks or could be higher quality of products are going to have higher employment. And they'll also be increasing in this, let's say, aggregate price indicator. Same for a profit function, both increasing. And again, obviously we're going to assume that there's enough fixed costs, so for some firms eventually will exit. So it's negative profits for sufficiently low individual shocks. Entrants draw from some given distribution of productivity, and pay a cost of entry. So there's no ex-ante heterogeneity of firms. They get all exposed heterogeneity after entry. The model accommodates, perfect, we have the paper show, perfect competition, monopolistic competition with CES framework, and also, models of, special models of variable markups. I'm just going to describe, I'm not going to go through the definition of equilibrium or anything, just describe the properties that are going to be the ones that we're going to use as our identification framework. So in this equilibrium, it turns out that this aggregate state is invariant. So this aggregate price is invariant to changes in population along the transition. And so that means that exit rates, average firm size, and size distribution for firm age are time invariant. I mean, this is good because it sort of matches what we started motivating, which is that all these aspects of firm demographics are age invariant. And so all the aggregate adjustments in this model will take place at the extensive margin, that is the margin of entry. In the margin of entry, as usual in these models, and as occurs actually also in reality, entry rates are very, much more volatile than exit rates. And this is capture basically the idea that a lot of this adjustment is taking place at the extensive margin of entry. All right, to get to our main equation, quantitative, that will help us look at the data. It's helpful to define these demographic variables. So SA will be the probability. This is the survival function, the probability that an entrant survives at least 8 periods. Obviously, SA will be declining with age as firms exit. But how high it is sort of how a high probability surviving age 8 periods. So this kind of period will be a year. Will be. EA is the average size of a firm of cohort of age A. Again, it's an object that we have seen before. We saw that it remains fairly constant through time. And now we can write the resource constraint, and this is where most of the action is going to come from. The resource constraint is we on the one hand side we have employment or labor force, and it's going to be, you can decompose in the employment of entrants, and it's MT is let's say the number of entrants in period T multiplied by the average size of an entrant, which is E0, and so that's employment by entrants, and then we have the employment by incumbents. Using this, we can find which is the mass of entrants or number of entrants. It's just going to be the gap that needs to be filled divided by the average size of an entrant. So that's our starting equation. And now we can express the employment of incumbents just by adding the employment of different cohorts of ages of firms. So each term here represents a cohort of age A. And so this says that, if we look at, firms that say of age 10, then this lag tells us, well, these firms entered 10 periods ago. And so how many entered that period? So it's just what was the initial size of that cohort? SA is the fraction of survivals up to age 10. So what fraction of those are still around? And so that the product of that tells us what is the number of firms that entered 10 periods ago that are age 10 today, multiplied by the average size of a firm of age 10. That gives us the total employment of the firms of age 10, then all added over all, different ages, starting from 1 onwards, it gives us the total employment of incumbents at time t. So we just substitute this back in the entry equation, and this gives us our main sort of, identifying equation, which basically shows you the feedback that, entry rates at time t are affected by are obviously affected by what is the population or employment at time t, but it's also affected by the history of entry rates in the previous period. So it's a sort of a distributed lag equation of entry rates, and it captures all the feedbacks of firm demographics on entry. So I don't know how am I doing in terms of time, because I need to. I think, Tiago, if you're telling me, I can't hear you because you're.
Sorry, you have 20 minutes, Hugo.
Okay, fine.
If you could stop a little bit early just for discussion, that would be okay, but that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. So let me show you first, long run effects. So by long run effects, we mean like if we were comparing two steady states, one with a growth rate of employment of, let's say, 2.5%, and the other with a growth rate of employment of only 0.5%. So there's some. By the way, well, I'll talk later if I have time, about the references. But let me go through this. And so, in the long run, average firm size in a balanced growth path is not changing, so that's 0. So the growth of the only feedback we have in the long run, obviously, is that changes in the growth rate of the number of workers, so the growth rate of labor force, are going to feed back on changes in exit rates, right? And so that is the only feedback in the long run. And the long run exit rate, we can write it this way. And I'm not going to bore you too much on this expression, but this is a sort of a steady state representation. So this is the on the left hand side we have what's the aggregate exit rate, and the aggregate exit rate in this economy is just going to be obviously a weighted average of the exit rates of different cohorts, right? And so on the right hand side here, what we have is a sum which is really a weighted average of the exit rates or hazard rate of exit of cohorts of age A, ranging from new firms all the way to as old as there are, as to the oldest firm. The weights here, which are the red portion of this equation, can be obviously depend on some constants, which are the survival function. So it's natural weights that you're going to give, declining, over the age of firms. But also there is this term that depends on kind of what's the growth rate in this economy. This is a growth rate of employment in this economy or labor force. And maybe you can't see it here, but if you increase the growth rate of labor force, what that does is it put more weights on younger firms, and so it shifts weight on the exit rates towards younger firms, and that's what what this is. And so basically, lower population growth would imply lower exit rates, and there is obviously a multiplier. As we change, the growth rate, we use this as we change, the growth rate of the labor force, we can figure out what's going to happen with the growth rate or what's going to happen to exit rates. And the multiplier, it's an empirical question. We find it to be in the order of like 1.5, and that's what I said before. The growth rate of labor force went from 2.5 to 0.5, so that's 2% change, and the change in exit rates, was of the order. I mean, in the long run, was in the order of 1% more. So that's that the 1.5 effect that I told you before. So that gives us the long run effect, and then there's also the adjustment path that I mentioned before, and I'll talk a little bit more as I look at the data on that. All right, so this is going to be our quantitative analysis. So we're going to take this identifying equation, and in a way, we can just run it, and that's going to give us, entry rates, implied entry rates. And the question we're going to address is, well, can changes in labor force growth quantitatively generate the secular changes that we've seen in the US economy? What's the role of these feedback mechanisms? I kind of highlighted already. And what's the role of the transitional dynamics, sort of the baby boom and adjustment path? In our quantitative, it will be just basically run this dynamic entry equation with labor force as a driver. I'm going to show you, we do it a couple of ways. I'm going to show you what we do with the standard sort of firm dynamics calibration model. So if I have time later, I may go into details if you want of the model itself. I'm just going to give you here the results. But basically the idea, well, maybe I should just, the idea here is we have a standard, production function that is homogeneous of degree alpha and labor. Productivity follows an AR1 process. Entrants draw the productivity of some normal distribution. And then, we fit, these numbers or these values. Well, first of all, in the model, there's some that we take as sort of a given caliber, standard used in the literature, and then we fit models to match some features of, firm dynamics. The important thing is that we're not using these parameters to match, what we are seeing in the data. Okay, so this is what we get. And so the red line now is the model. The blue line, as before, was the data. And the lighter line is, what you would get is just feeding in labor force without any interaction with firm demographics. So that, for example, would be a model where you assume firms are exiting exogenously, or for those of you that are familiar, like the Mortensen-Pisaridis, that firms just redraw periodically from the same distribution. Those would have no age or no demographics effects, and so that's what you would get, the upper line here. Okay. So you can see the model, does quite well in terms of matching the data, even though there's a lot of ways in which the model is an approximation. These are non-targeted moments. We do fairly well, I guess, on the decline in exit rates, not on the cyclical part of it, but on the trend in exit rates, fairly well on the increase in concentration. We tend to overshoot on the growth of average firm size and also concentration. This is partly due to the fact that we're not taking into account the fact what I showed you before, which is that in fact there is a decline in the concentration and average firm size for older firms in the data. What's the last part, that we're going to talk about here in the decomposition is the role of transitional dynamics. So we saw that the total gap in entry rates is of the order of 6%. So that's the decline in entry rates. Okay. So as I mentioned before, when we look at the long run, 2% of that is the direct effect of population demographics. And this indirect effect that I mentioned, this multiplier, long run multiplier of exit rates, is 1%. So this is, by the way, this is illustrated also in a paper by Karahan, Puxley, and Sahin. This is kind of the first paper that looked at, the changes in labor force as a driver for explaining changes in entry rates. It's a really good paper, and it looks at that even, in a much more thorough empirical analysis for the U.S. economy across states and so on, or regions. Finally, there's this fact that, I mean, all these long run only account for half of the whole picture. So, there's 3% left. What are the, other factors that are good? Well, one is that we're not starting at a steady state, and we're not yet at a steady state. So obviously, doing a, steady state comparison is going to miss something, which is the transitional band. So let me kind of show you to what extent, we're not in a steady state. Well, we're not in a steady state. Let me go to the previous picture. Oops. Well, I guess let me just. So we're not at a steady state because what we have is that there's been a up to the mid-1970s, there's been a growth in the entry rates in this economy. And so as entry rates have been going up, that means when I'm looking at, the population of firms in 1980, what I'm seeing is a very large fraction, were just recent entrants, because that's when the entry rate was the highest, right? And then as I go further back in terms of, further back in terms of entry time, the size of those cohorts are going to be smaller and smaller because precisely they were small relative to the existing cohort, the entering cohort now. And so that's going to obviously mean that as I look at older firms, these are firms that entered before, and so they entered when there was lower entry rates. Consequently, there's they're going to be have a lower weight in terms of employment, right? That's very different than if we had a sort of as a counterfactual to do. Let's say you had fixed entry rates at a constant level. In this case, this 12.5% that we were talking about, right? And what you see is that if we had a constant rather than rising to the 12%, 12.5%, a constant, 12% entry rates, then, this is what we would have seen in terms of the evolution. Well, I mean, the difference tells you the gap that is explained because of this baby boom effect, right? Finally, we have the fact, so that's one part, a reason why, the baby boom is going to exacerbate, the results. And as a consequence, it's going to increase the impact of the change in firm demographics and consequently the role of firm demographics in the whole picture. And then the other part is, of course, we're not yet at the steady state. So these are basically running our model ahead. So this is kind of playing guru and running our model ahead and saying, what does our model predict? Feeding in, trend, or what is kind of the expected trend in the labor force growth. And so we feed that in. You can see that there is a kind of a comeback. And part of the reason by that is we've been going through a declining, labor force growth. And so because it's declining, we get the opposite effect, the compositional effect that I described before in the baby boom. Now we have that young firms are, less, or older firms are overly represented because those are the firms that came at the height of the baby boom, relative to the young firms, which are the firms that are coming in now. But of course, that's going to get corrected over time as kind of the growth rate of population stabilizes, right? And so that's why you would get that, this is, there's going to be a recovery in entry rates, and together with the recovery in entry rates, that's going to shift a little bit more of the population to younger firms. Exit rates are going to go up, and at the same time, concentration will go down and average firm size will go down. So those are predictions that, our model makes about the future. So summary of these effects: total fall in entry rate 6%. 2% is the direct effect of decline in labor force growth. 1 extra % comes from the long run decline in exit rates. And then the remaining 3% is split kind of equally between the fact that we had a baby boom, so non-steady state up to the peak, and then that we're not at a steady state yet. Okay. All right, so I haven't said anything about the fall in labor share. In a way, I mean, the paper by the superstar firms, it's a paper by Otter and co-authors, Otter and co-authors, That paper basically shows that the rise in markups and the fall in labor share has been mostly the result of changes in the changes in concentration. And we've shown here, we have a vehicle in our model that explains where these changes in concentration might be coming from, which is this change in composition and the age firm structure, age distribution structure. So in a way, I mean, we could say, well, I mean, we don't need to say anymore because, you know, indirectly, since we are able to account for most of the rise in concentration, and that's basically the main driver in the rise in, or the decline in share of labor force or rise in markups, then that would be end of story. I mean, we do something just to kind of motivate, you know, and provide our own benchmark calculation for this. And the way we do this is we take our model, and so we're looking at labor share in our model. And in our model, we have fixed cost and we have variable cost. And so fixed cost, you can think about overhead labor. And this has been used, you know, by Haltewanger and others as a way of trying to account for the variations in labor productivity across firms in the US. Then we have the, you know, compensation to production labor, which is in the model, this share of value added by assumption, because we're taking a homogeneous production function is this alpha that I had before, which, you know, it's fixed, you know, and then we estimate in a way how labor, you know, overhead labor, or calibrate how overhead labor changes with value added to fit some moments that have to do with the, you know, the variance of, again, you know, average productivity, labor productivity across firms. We've done it also with the OP covariance, and similarly. And this term we find is declining in firm size. And then, of course, I mean, this coincides with the empirical facts that are found, you know, were found by Otter and co-authors that paper, the superstar firms. So once you take this and you plug it in our, you know, simulation, you know, it's basically the path that is simulated, you know, running that equation that we started with the aid of our firm dynamic model. So what we get there is, you know, we get the red line. So this is the one implied by us. So if you look at the decline that people have emphasized, that people have been looking at, so our model explains, you know, quite a large fraction of that decline, maybe 2/3 of the decline in labor share. But if also, of course, because the opposite force was present before, you know, this peak in 1980, our model also predicts that there must have been a rising labor share prior to that, in a quite, you know, similar order of magnitude. In this paper by Santulalia and Zheng, I mean, I guess this is now a new Econometrica paper, shows that there is an inverted U actually in the data. And all right, so this is, as you know, where we talked about, you know, the importance of the change in firm demographics and explaining much of this rise in concentration, fall of labor share, and we haven't documented it here, but we also find that it's an important part of the slowdown and reallocation of labor across firms. We accounted for the fall in entry rates, and the change in labor force growth is, you know, the big driving force according to what, you know, our decomposition. And let me just, you know, give a pitch, because, you know, there's a lot of papers now on the, you know, and this is sort of a big picture pitch, right? There's a lot of papers now trying to explain these facts, and there are many different, you know, stories. You going from one is, you know, maybe saying there's no really, it's just a measurement problem, like omitted measurement, like, you know, for instance, you know, Jeremy was talking about the omitted measurement of advertising. Well, there's other forms, even R&D and so on, intangibles at the firm level that are not measured, and so there are claims that it's mostly a question about measurement. And to others that are trying to find models where perhaps there's been some change in economies of scale of some sort, like with this information technologies and that have high fixed costs but lower your marginal cost, and so are adopted only by good firms. And there's a series of several papers that have pushed that idea. And one of the things that we want to say is that we think this source that we're talking about, even if it's not the only source, it's just too big to ignore. So let me just give you the hypothetical exercise. Suppose that you write a model in where you completely omit the source of these sources of variation, like these demographics and the interaction with firm demographics and so on. Then and your model will have to load on some parameter the changes that we've seen in entry rates, and all these models do. And it could be via an engineered increase in entry cost, or some other increase in economies of scale that make it harder for younger firms to compete, and so on, and declining their profitability. Well, all these in a way will have to load. If you miss this, it's like misspecification. All models are misspecified, but maybe some are more misspecified than others, but all models are misspecified. And so of course, the parameters that we assign are always wrong in a sense, but there are approximations. I'm just saying if you omit this such a big important source, you're bound to just load a lot on other parameters that will have to do the job to explain the decline in entry rates in the model. And the other part I think that is key. I think two things, right? One is that it's very important to consider these feedback effects of firm demographics when you think about entry rates, and also transitional dynamics. These played a major role in a steady state comparison, of a long run steady state comparison can take you long ways into understanding this, but as we show, it might explain perhaps half of the picture, but half of it is really transitional dynamics. So transitional dynamics have played a major role, and might imply that there's going to be, to some extent, as we've seen, a reversal of the trends that up to now. I guess that's the end.
Thank you very much, Hugo. On time also. I'll do the following. I will formally finish and thank you both. And then I'll leave the room if others, they want to stay here and make questions. So I want to give you some of applause, virtual applause. And thank you both for the lovely talk. But if others, they want to stay here and they want to make questions for both Hugo and Jeremy, feel free to stay.
Can I make a comment to Hugo, Tiago?
Yes, of course, Jeremy.
First of all, I should say, again, thanks for inviting Hugo and me. It was a great session. And Hugo, I really loved your paper. And I was wondering, because I was I'm in the process of writing a paper on Kuznets facts for family economists. And so I had some facts on my mind. I was just looking up what we had in our paper. So if you look at cross-country population growth rates, there's a huge variance across country. So I'm looking at now, say for Argentina had a huge secular decline, not much of a baby boom. Mexico has, a big baby boom and a fast decline. So you could look at cross-country stuff, right? Because given the huge variation in, how fast all across the world populations are fertility is declining, but in some countries much more rapidly than others. Like Korea has a drastic drop, and I know a huge increase in concentration. So that for businesses that would go your way. I don't know if you thought of looking at that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, I mean that comes up definitely. I mean, let me say that this paper that I mentioned by Karahan, Puxley, and Sahin, they compare across different counties or states, I don't remember, in the US, where the declines have not been, obviously the population or the demographics have not been the same across different states. I mean, you have the issues about, instrumenting, to take care of endogeneity. And they show precisely, a very strong driver of, these changes in population growth on entry rates. As far as the world is concerned, of course, you need to take into consideration other factors that might generate differences. But yes, I mean, we definitely need to do that. We haven't found as good, data for entry rates. I mean, population is fine. You can find it, almost everywhere. But it's not that easy to find, the data, comprehensive data on firm entry rates. And so that's the only issue. My co-authors are, working on a paper in which they're comparing. Well, they are both in the UK, right? And so they're comparing UK again.
Julian is here. Just to say that Julian is here. So
yeah, Julian.
Julian's here. Yeah.
I mean, maybe Julian, hey, Julian, you want to say something about this? I mean, about.
Oh. Yeah, so I can actually say a bit about the UK. So there's new paper that's finding that the UK had a declining concentration since about 2000, where the UK data starts, and the labor force growth seems to have been also different for the UK. And so we're running the model, and we're actually getting a decline. If you just take the US calibration and feed in UK labor force data, you're actually finding that these lead to a declining concentration, which is opposite to the experience of the US. So anyway, this is very, very recent, but yeah, we're definitely looking at that and trying to exploit. The problem is firm demographics data outside of the US is very sketchy. So have to deal with that.
But you probably want to look for countries that have a rapid decline in maybe more recent years, right? But they're because I understand you're not going to be able to go back and get exit and entry rates, but you probably can get them from the 90s or the 80s, right? For most countries, I would think.
Yeah, it's even for the UK, it's a challenge. The BDS is the standard where we get it for the US. So we're working on it. Hopefully, we can get better data, and then yeah, that'll be the next thing to attempt.
Just because it's the Brazilian conference, you can get Brazilian data going back to at least the 90s.
Actually, Brazilian data is by some of the best in the world, right? And I see.
It would be fantastic if we can, yeah, Cesar, if we can.
I would say the Brazilian data would be good. The only problem is that the informal economy is really
okay.
a large part of it. And so how you do that, I mean, it's just a big.
Well, the population, not the population, the household surveys.
That's true.
Where they ask, people what size of firm they're in and so on, do not have that problem, right? I mean, there should be comprehensive. So maybe that could be used.
So may I make a small comment? What do you think it's can be like a composition, sectorial composition? Do you see if, I don't know, like some sector, let's say, larger than others, more concentrated than others, harder to get in, is there any kind of effect of these or even?
Well, we did look at, at very aggregate sectors, right? We looked at, services, retail, wholesale, manufacturing, except for manufacturing that has its own, things going on. And I think, there might be other explanations there that have to do with the globalization and so on. What we see is that these facts hold pretty much in all the industries. So it's a pretty, even controlling for industries. There's been obviously a reallocation across industries, and so there isn't, you know, a question there of, you know, what that might do. On the other hand, you know, the data that, you know, we show at the aggregate, you know, it seems that reallocation is, whatever it is not changing kind of this aggregate facts about firm dynamics.
Yeah.
So,
but Hugo, would you think like that firms that cater to older people, maybe healthcare and stuff, that pattern might be different from them, just like following through from your theory?
Yeah, I mean, we're saying is whether the firm demographic characteristics of those firms is different than of the firms that are catered for younger people. That would be your question. I mean,
yeah, I was thinking
if they're in a way a copy in terms of firm demographic characteristics, it wouldn't matter, right? So the question,
no, I'm saying they're a copy, but they're facing different age distributions. So maybe you have like a firm that's selling, you know, baby cribs,
yeah,
and another firm, they're, I don't know, old age homes or something. So as the population ages, you would see the decline in entry in the baby cribs would happen.
no, right. What I'm saying is there's going to be a reallocation across these different groups of firms. The question is how neutral that is relative to the aggregates. Obviously depends on how those, you know, age intensive or dependent products, what are the firm dynamic properties of the firms in those, in those, right? I
would say they're the same. I would just say it's a generic firm or something.
Right. But, I mean, the key here is that if all it's like generic firms, and if all the reallocation takes place at the extensive margin, so there's enough, you know, natural exit rates that you can accommodate these changes in kind of the composition of firms, and sectoral composition or like a product composition of firms, purely by changes in the inflow of firms, right? Then, you know, in the class of models that we're thinking about, that would be kind of neutral on aggregates. But that assumes, again, that, you know, exit rates, so the two key features that I showed, which were the survival function, this SA, and the average size of firms by cohort, EA, kind of are similar across these different product groups.
Hugo and Jeremy, we have actually another meeting in 3 minutes.
Okay.
They are going to kick us out. I mean, in normal times, they would kick us out, you know.
Physically.
Yeah.
So great to have you. It's really, really pleasure. And hopefully we are going to fix this, invite you, you know, in person to Brazil once.
And Hugo, Thiago and I are in Europe too. We would love the caipirinha as well. So we're on the same boat.
Julian too, and Julian too. So
okay, yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Hugo.
All right.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.